Hi, this is Peter, the Adult Ministries Director from Browncroft Community Church. This fall, we have started a brand new series on the book of Daniel. It's a wonderful, complex, and really applicable book to us today. So what we want to do is we want to help you understand this book to apply it to your life. So not only are we going to be recommending resources, but we are going to be interviewing pastors, scholars, and commentators of this book. Even though Daniel was written a long time ago, we believe that it still applies to us today. So we're looking through journeying through this book together as a church community. Welcome to the Understanding Daniel podcast brought to you by Browncroft Community Church. This is our first episode. We are going to do a series of conversations on the book of Daniel, which is an extraordinary, wonderful, but also not the easiest book to understand. And today I am honored to be with commentator and scholar and someone who has influenced the way that I study the Bible and especially the Old Testament, Dr. Tremper Longman. Tremper, how are you doing today?
Great, Peter. Thanks for inviting me to talk with you about the book of Daniel.
That's awesome. Well, before we get started, I do have to hold up the NIV application commentary, which Tremper not only is an author of the commentary of Daniel, but he is one of the editors. And what I love about this commentary, when anybody asks me, how do I go deeper? This is usually the commentary set that I start them with. So, Tremper, after we talked about the commentary, we'll come back to that. Let me start here with you. What is so intriguing to you personally about the book of Daniel that would cause you to want to be a scholar about it?
Well, it's a fascinating book in the way it combines 6 stories about Daniel and the 3 friends living in a foreign court, and then 4 apocalyptic visions in the last 6 chapters. The combination is intriguing. The message is difficult for modern 21st century Westerners to grab a hold of. But if you put yourself back in the ancient context, and, my doctoral work was in the area of ancient Mesopotamian literature and history. And of course, Daniel is situated initially in the Babylonian court and then at the end in the Persian court. All these things just really intrigued me, and once you understand that the Bible wasn't written to us but to ancient people, and then we start to put ourselves in the place of those ancient people, then the book actually becomes pretty clear and pretty easy to understand, if I might put it so boldly.
Well, if it's okay, I'm going to just change a little bit of our structure just because you've opened the door. If I'm a 21st century American, what do I need to understand about Daniel, the Mesopotamia, since you did a whole thesis on it? What are the things that I need to understand for it to become more clear?
Well, my thesis wasn't actually specifically on Daniel, but my doctoral studies were on, studying ancient Near Eastern, particularly Babylonian literature. My thesis was actually more relevant to the book of Ecclesiastes, but I think the first thing I want to affirm, first of all, whenever I talk about this, that you could get the basic message of any biblical book without any training in ancient Near Eastern studies. The Bible's main message is really clear, but we have to acknowledge that the books of the Bible, every book of the Bible, the Old and New Testament, wasn't written to us, but it was written to an ancient audience. Think about the book of Romans in the New Testament. It's called the book of Romans because it's written to the Roman church. It's not written to us. So, and we see this most pointedly right at the beginning when we realized that the book of Daniel is written half in Hebrew and half in Aramaic, two languages that no one grew up learning. Even modern Hebrew is different than ancient Hebrew. So we have to make effort to translate and to understand, say, the imagery of the visions in the second half of the book. So just to take one example that we might develop more later, this idea of four beasts arising out of a chaotic sea sounds kind of science fiction-y or fantasy literature to us, but really is well used and well recognized imagery in the ancient Near East. The sea was a symbol elsewhere in the Bible, but also in the ancient Near East, of chaos and evil. The beasts associated with the sea often symbolize evil. The first beast is a mixture of human, eagle, and so you have this mixed essences, which in the ancient Near East and in Israel would be considered repulsive. So, I mean, there's a lot in Daniel chapter 1, even understanding how the Babylonian court functioned, what in the world is Daniel and the three friends being brought as basically hostages to they're of the noble class. They're being brought to the Babylonian court. They're being trained in Babylonian ways. That's a very common thing that happened when a nation defeated another nation. So understanding customs, symbols, metaphors really help us dig deeper into the text.
Those were super helpful. I'm really glad you brought up those examples, because I think that the Bible is accessible even without a Near Eastern PhD, right, but these little intricacies help it so much. So let's kind of back up to where we were going to start, just kind of this is an intro. When you think of Daniel and the whole Bible, in its place in the Old Testament, how it, points to the New Testament and Jesus, why is it so important to the whole story of the Bible?
That's a great question. We could spend a long time on. I'll try to be concise here, and we can approach that really good question in different ways. First of all, let's talk about where Daniel is situated in terms of the kind of chronological narrative arc of the Bible. As I said, Daniel is in the he's in the Babylonian exile, and the Babylonian exile is toward the end of the Old Testament time period. Nebuchadnezzar has subjugated Jerusalem. Well, he hadn't completely subjugated it. When the book actually opens in what we can discern as 605 BC, during the third year of King Jehoiakim. And it's really the first time that Nebuchadnezzar, and the Babylonian Empire is on the upswing. They've just defeated the Assyrians. And now what in Daniel chapter 1, Nebuchadnezzar is doing is reducing Judah to the status of a vassal. And as part of that process, taking some of the young noble class and training them in Babylonian ways. But so you're getting toward the end of the Old Testament time period. And of course, the Old Testament starts with the story of the creation and the flood, and then Abraham, and now they're living in exile. And the message of the book of Daniel is addressed to the exilic and post-exilic community, because by the end of the book of Daniel, by the end of Daniel's life, the Persians have defeated the Babylonians. And we don't learn this from Daniel, we learn this from Ezra that and Chronicles, Cyrus, the Persian king, allows the Jews to return if they wish to. And but there's still, at the end of the book and into the future, God's people are still under the oppressive hand of a powerful nation. Babylon's replaced by Persia. Persia will be replaced by the Greek kingdoms post Alexander the Great, and then the Romans in 63 BC. So the message of the book of Daniel is, and all 6 stories and all 4 apocalyptic visions have the same message, which is you are living in difficult, evil times, and it looks like evil has the upper hand against you. But let me tell you 6 stories and give you 4 visions that'll show you that God is the one who's really in control, and he's going to have the definite victory at the end. So the message of the book of Daniel, which is very similar to the message of the book of Revelation in the New Testament, is to give hope to people who are living under oppression, persecution, marginalization. And so it serves a very important point. It also, if I could just maybe tag on one more little. So if you look from the Old Testament into the New Testament, we get these pictures of God as a warrior. In the Old Testament, God comes as a warrior and defeats Israel's Canaanite enemies. Sometimes we see God as a warrior coming to judge Israel itself. But the book of Daniel and other post-exilic prophets like Zechariah and Malachi have a message, which is God, the warrior, is going to come again, and he is going to rescue you from these oppressive enemies. And so Daniel, Zechariah, Malachi, and others, their message kind of reverberates through the intertestamental period and then is picked up in the New Testament by John the Baptist, who says, one is coming after me whose sandals you're not able, sandals I'm not able to tie or whatever. And he's going to come and he's going to gather all the chaff and burn it with unquenchable fire and chop out the rotten wood. And then Jesus comes and he goes out and preaches the message of, salvation, peace. And John the Baptist sends 2 disciples up to him in Matthew 11 and says, with the question, are you the one or should we expect another? And I think what John the Baptist is saying, hey, Jesus, where's the axe chopping? Where's the fire burning? And Jesus goes out and does more of the same. And what we see is that Jesus is the divine warrior, but he's heightened and intensified the war so that it's directed toward the spiritual powers and authority. And that enemy is not defeated by killing, but by dying on the cross. And then, of course, the book of Revelation shows that John the Baptist is not wrong, except about timing. And so the book of Revelation gives this picture, like in a place like Revelation 19:11 and following, of Jesus coming and bringing final judgment against all evil, both human and spiritual. So my point back to Daniel is Daniel plays a very pivotal role in that, what we might call biblical theology of God's warfare against evil.
That was super helpful. Before we go any further, let me just kind of recap what I think I heard. So like in the Old Testament, the golden era is when King David's on the throne and Jerusalem falls and the Israelites fall. And Daniel really opens up when Judah, which is the southern kingdom of Jerusalem, goes into exile, and it kind of ends towards Ezra when people are being sent back. And what you're saying is when we get to the New Testament, Jerusalem isn't overtaken by the Babylonians, it's overtaken by the Romans. But this whole book has really two major themes, which is you can trust God in really hard times, but then also it points to Jesus as this warrior. And of course, when we read the Gospels in the New Testament, we're sitting there and we're thinking, well, Jesus is going to overthrow the Roman government, but really Daniel's pointing towards Revelation that says, hey, this is when the end of the world comes. This is what it is. Is that a good summary, or did I miss anything there?
That's a great summary. I would just maybe underline the idea that even in his work on the cross, that's considered a victory over the spiritual powers and authority, and already not yet one. So you have a passage like Colossians 2:13-15 that uses military language to describe how God has defeated the spiritual powers and authority, and Ephesians 4 verse 8, which talks about the ascension as a kind of military parade with all the prisoners in tow. So yeah, that's a great summary of what I was trying to get at. Thanks.
Well, and I love the context with that. So let me, you and I, before the camera started, we were talking about, when you're a Daniel scholar, you all of a sudden get pulled into all these Bible studies. So I'm thinking about the individual, but also the small group. So there's individuals, this is their first time really engaging in the book of Daniel. There's small groups that they're going to read these. And I guess as someone that's probably led more Daniel small groups than I've probably ever met before, what would you want to do to help prepare individuals and small groups to talk about the book of Daniel so that, to not get stuck? What are some key insights?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I don't want this to sound like elitist scholarly stuff, but because it's not. I mean, God has raised up different people in the church to help in different ways. And I'm of the guild of biblical scholars who write commentaries and stuff. So to be honest, I think it is on a practical level, and then I'll get to some actually interpretive points, but I think it's really helpful to find good resources, Bibles, it could be the NIV Study Bible, NLT Study Bible, ESV Study Bible, commentaries like the one I've written, but others as well. Because, again, I think the first thing a small group leader needs to acknowledge is, as we did earlier, is that this is an ancient book. This is a book that's going to be filled with a lot of things that are strange to me. And then talk to your pastor and others about what are the good resources, because there is some popular teaching on Daniel and Revelation which takes advantage of the fact that it's hard for us to understand, and they read all kinds of fanciful interpretations into it. And just as one assertion here, connected to that is neither Daniel nor Revelation is giving you any information that will help you determine when Jesus is coming again. That's not what these books are for. There are not signs of the time that when you see them, it means that Jesus is coming within the next 2 or 3 years. It's all those signs of the time are around wars and rumors of wars and things like that. There's signs of the time that we're not at the end yet. So that's the first thing to do the study beforehand. Get your small group to do some preliminary work too. But what's really important whenever you're reading anything is to understand what type of literature you're reading. Technically, that's called genre. Know the genre of the book that you're reading. And the Bible has many different types of books, and different types of books trigger different reading strategies. Makes a big difference to use another book as an example. When you read the Song of Songs, which begins, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine," it makes a big difference if you think it's some kind of allegory, which it's not, of the relationship between Jesus and the church, or that it's a love poem. Now, I think it's a love poem that has theological significance, but it's really important to understand what type of literature you're reading. And Daniel has two different genres. It has these stories, which I think are based on real events, but they're told in such a way as to impart that message we talked about earlier, in spite of difficulties. God's in control and he'll have the final victory. So be faithful, as we see the three friends doing when they won't bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's golden statue. And so I think and then the apocalyptic visions at the end, to know that they're highly, highly symbolic, and then to dig into the meaning of the symbolism. So those are some things I think it's really important to keep in mind.
So something I want to key in on, because I think you said this so brilliantly that it's super helpful. We read Daniel and it just feels like this vast chasm contextually. But I think even just listening to you, the original readers read Daniel, it seems to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, it was encouraging, it was inspiring. Yes. So I think even walking in from what you're saying is, hey, if the original readers are reading this as encouraging, as inspiring, how does that affect the way I look at it?
Absolutely. And here, notice a difference between a prophet like Jeremiah and an apocalyptic figure like Daniel. A prophet receives a message from God, which he is to relate to the people, and it's a message of, you need to repent. Prophets are, I often call them covenant lawyers of God. You've broken the covenant. Here are the penalties of the covenant. Repent or else. Whereas Daniel is addressed to the people of God, but the faithful people of God who are suffering and scared and maybe wavering in their faith about God and his goodness or whatever. And Daniel's message, even though if you're on the wrong side of the divide, and maybe I'll say a word about that in a moment, it is scary, but to the people of God, it's a message of hope and reassurance and saying God's in control. And by the way, that's the same with the book of Revelation. I more recently wrote a commentary on Revelation in a series called The New Testament Through Old Testament Eyes, published by Kriegel. And Revelation functions the same way. And that's why, by the way, and I think that the message of Daniel and Revelation are incredibly important today, not because we're near the end times. Who knows? We won't know until the end times happen. Could be tomorrow, could be thousands of years from now. But because we live in a time when Christians are tempted to be fearful and angry, and the book of Daniel and Revelation, because they feel marginalized, they feel persecuted, and unfortunately, some think that the proper response to that is to try to grab power and to shape things. I won't go political, but I will say that the message of the Daniel and Revelation speak against that. by giving us hope and confidence that God is in control. We're not in control, but God is in control.
I want to come back to you because maybe you looped it and I missed it, but you were going to talk about the divide. So I think what I heard you were about to say is, if you're on God's side, this is really encouraging. Right. Oh, yeah, but if you're not on God's side, then...
Well, I'll give you an anecdote. So I'm 16, 17 years old. I have a girlfriend. I'm not a Christian. She hands me a book recently published called The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. So I read this book. And of course, today I totally disagree with his interpretive approach. But he got one thing right, which is that Daniel in Revelation says, that God is a God who judges sin. And I was on the sin side at that time. And so a proper reaction was fear, which drove me to turn to Jesus at that time. And so I actually think Daniel and Revelation have an important place in gospel proclamation. So,
no, that's really good. So a couple more things, and then we'll close, because this has been, Tremper, I just appreciate hearing you, and even in some of the one book you have, the Confronting Old Testaments, I can hear you talk, and as I've read that. So usually, sometimes podcast guests come back and say, "I want you to ask this question," and you did. And the question that you wanted to respond to, which I think is a pretty powerful one, which is, how does the message of Daniel speak to the church today? I'd love to just hear your response to the question you threw out there.
Yeah. But I think, Peter, we've already pretty much gotten the gist of it. And that is that the church needs to hear the message that the original audience heard. Which is, don't be afraid, even though it seems like the world's falling apart out there, that the forces of secularism are taking over or whatever. God's the one who's really in control. And our task is to be faithful to reach out to others, and live in community together. So, so I think it's an important message for today, to be sure. And it's really interesting to read those stories about Daniel and his three friends and the kind of faith they display in the midst of the most dangerous circumstances.
I love that. We'll do just two more questions. I want to come back to, I love how we're introing, because I think in some ways this is kind of like a kind syllabus, where it's like, hey, the first 6 chapters are really great. 7 through 12, you might be a little confused, but just a couple things that you said that I think is important. I grew up in a faith tradition that really valued the rapture, like just that was a motivation for missionary work. And like, I'm so thankful for that. But one of the things I loved that you said was about the different times when people, thought Jesus was coming back. I was just thinking at the end of World War II, when Israel became a nation, tons of people thought Jesus was coming back. I remember, 87 reasons Jesus is coming in 1987, 88 reasons why Jesus is coming back in 88. I'm not sure if 1989 was written, but why don't you kind of, as not just a scholar, but a follower of Jesus, how do you reconcile this? You called it the already but not yet, which is a very biblical tension. How do you manage this tension of, hey, Jesus could come back before we end recording this podcast, but also Jesus might not come back for 100 years.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile all of that together?
Yeah, let me just mention that in 1994, I debated a guy named Harold Camping in front of 1,000 people. And Harold Camping is the man who wrote the book 1994 ? And I think I began that debate by saying, because at that time in 94, he go, Mr. Camping, I have 3 teenage sons. No one wants Jesus to come back more than I do. And everybody applauded. And then I said, well, let me tell you why he's not coming back in September 94, or why he might not come back. Well, the way I manage it is to do my best, but in my failing way, to live as if Jesus is coming back tomorrow on the one hand, but also live as if he's coming back in 100 years. In other words, I'm not doing what some of those people did back then. Some of my friends, even when they thought Jesus was coming back in September 94, they had conflicts with their wives that they didn't reconcile. They ran up their credit card to the max and weren't worried about paying it back because they were thinking Jesus is coming back in a couple months. Don't live like that, but also don't live like he might not come back tomorrow. So we're always to be ready. And but on the other hand, well, I think it's apocryphal, but I think it was Luther said, I think I got it mixed up with George Washington once when I said, Luther said, if Christ is coming tomorrow, I'm planting a cherry tree today. It wasn't a cherry tree, but he said something about planting a tree today. So
one kind of last question. I think of it could sum up what we've already said, but if Daniel showed up in you live on the West Coast, I live on the East Coast, but if Daniel showed up in America today, and just kind of closing our time together, what do you think he would tell Americans, followers of Jesus in the American church? What do you think he would say to us?
Well, first of all, I'll mention I moved from Santa Barbara, California to Alexandria, Virginia a few years ago. Both on the coast. So I get out to Santa Barbara all the time. But what he would say, again, his main message, don't be afraid. Be faithful. Don't be afraid because it looks like the forces of evil or whatever are in charge, because they're not. God is in charge, and he will have the final victory. And so act like it. Don't act angry and fearful, but act as one who knows that God is going to win the final victory.
I love that. Well, if you're looking at Tremper's screen, his commentary is in the top, I think it's left, it's the yellow one, but this is the NIV application for Tremper. And so small groups, we're going to be going through, and other individuals in this podcast, we're going to be interviewing other commentators about this book. But Tremper, I just thank you for opening us up. I really loved the way that you really simplified and applied it. So thank you so much for the generosity of your time.
Oh, thank you, Peter. It was my privilege. And enjoy studying Daniel.